Our next speaker is Baldur Bjarnason. He's here from Unbound. Baldur was here last year with us and was immensely popular with the audience. So by popular request, we have brought him back for our second year of ebookcraft. So I'll turn things over to Baldur.
Well, today I'm going to be talking about, well, JavaScript. Not JavaScript in the ebook, but JavaScript everywhere else. I'm Baldur Bjarnason. Now, technically, usually when I talk about what I do, I basically say that I make ebooks or I do digital production and everything like that, along those lines. But that's not the pitch that I sold my employers on the idea of employing me. My pitch was quite simply that over time, I tried to figure out how to automate everything that we can't automate at the moment. So instead of making all of these ebooks by hand, whenever we encounter a difficult problem that is clearly repeatable, we'd figure out how to repeat it. And so slowly over time, we'd be able to scale up our production even without scaling up our staff. And as you can imagine, that for a startup CEO, the word scale and scaling is sort of like a magic word. I didn't know that at the time until I found that out afterwards. But if you ever want to earn a job interview with a startup CEO, make sure that you mention that what you're planning to do will help him scale up the company, and they'll sort of get these sort of lights in their eyes and a manic look. My goal today is to convince you of two things. The first one is that software projects should start small and scale up. And the second one is that JavaScript is the tool for that job of making these small and upscalable software projects. So I'm actually going to start with talking about why JavaScript is appropriate. And sort of as the alternative title for this talk, which was what I was originally going to go with, which, although it sounds slightly less fun, isn't that fun? But, this is usually the most common response. And, I don't blame you. It's sort of, JavaScript has this awful reputation. It doesn't matter which side you come from. From the programming side, they see this as this hacky, glued together, sort of catastrophic mess of a programming language. And if you come from the other side of people who are, in editorial and everywhere else, they just see this as this alien thing that belongs to the browser and doesn't really even belong to ebooks. But sort of. My case is that those are actually kind of qualities that are really useful in the way we do things, or have to do things. But the core reason why this is actually a better idea than it seems is that long-term, our reliance on buying your tools really cuts down your independence in your decision-making, your strategy, and what you can do with your company. And if the sooner you can start migrating over to making your own tools, even in these sort of small corners or edge cases, the more independent you become of other people's agendas. It's like, how many of us are just doing nothing but executing Adobe's publishing strategy? We're literally just going by the playbook that they've laid out for us. And they aren't in the business of publishing. They don't actually know really what are the good ideas and what's the right thing to do. And the only way we can actually build a sensible playbook and a sensible strategy for what we do is to start building our own tools. And here's usually where everybody runs into the first problem, and that's the issue with. They start big. They decide this is a big problem that is actually bigger than anything we can buy in, and then everything catastrophically explodes. Because they're trying. The reason why there aren't any pre-made tools for big problems is because they're big problems. But toolmaking, successful toolmaking almost always starts small. You start with small, hacky solutions, a script here to automate a thing that you discovered that you keep copying and pasting this thing all over, sort of every single day. So that's where you start. You start with the small, tiny things that fill up your time but shouldn't. And that's kind of where we get to JavaScript. JavaScript works really well for a small, tiny thing. The fact that the programming class tends to dismiss it as a scripting language is actually kind of part of what makes it awesome. You know, it is this teeny tiny built up of teeny tiny building blocks that sometimes gel together, but often quite don't. But that's actually a good recipe for making scripts and small tools. Another reason why JavaScript is really useful in the context that what we do is JavaScript is web native. I mean, it was invented for browsers, and it just really works well with HTML and CSS. And that it doesn't matter if you look at browsers or through Node and other environments, there are an absolute mess of tools for working with HTML and CSS, which is very useful for people like us who make ebooks, which happen to be made out of, well, HTML and CSS. So there's a convergence there that should be obvious. And JavaScript as a skill, both organizationally and personally, is eminently reusable. I mean, it's used in browsers, it's used in app automation. Am I right in thinking that a lot of Adobe's products use JavaScript as one of the automation sort of scripting APIs? Yeah, I see people nodding in the. So you can use it pretty much. Use JavaScript pretty much everywhere. Servers, plugin, apps, automation, browsers. But the thing that really enabled sort of the JavaScript to break out as a tool, both on the server and as a script, is this nifty little thing, where it's literally just a bunch of people that went into Chrome and just pulled out the JavaScript bits and left the rest. It's literally the browser JavaScript engine from Chrome. Node.js opens up the it does standalone scripts. You don't need to do the whole browser refresh. You're not tied to the browser ecosystem. And it lets you make command line tools. Most people use it for servers. I use it for command line tools because I think they're awesome. But more importantly for me, it makes JavaScript fun. You don't have to worry about old browsers or compatibility problems or the DOM, which is DOM's a nightmare. I mean, when people say they hate JavaScript, they hate the document object model. They don't hate JavaScript, they hate the DOM. And Node gives, the Node gives you JavaScript without the DOM, which is kind of fun. But tying with what I was talking about earlier, there are a few what I consider to be ironclad laws of software development. There are quite a few of the four. There are four of them that sort of I think dominate. I'm going to focus on the last one, but the first two in my view are basically Hofstadter's law, which is it always takes longer even when you take into account Hofstadter's law. So it doesn't matter the time that you budget for something, it's going to be later. And a corollary, the second law is basically a corollary of Hofstadter's law, which is that it means because time is money, that means that everything will always go over budget. The third law is comes from the mythical man month, which is that whenever you add staff to a software project, it will go even later. So adding people to a late software project will make it even later. But the final law, which is the one that I think is publishing tends to break the most often and tends to completely ignore, is this one, Gall's law. A complex system that works is invariably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. The inverse proposition also appears to be true. A complex system designed from scratch never works and cannot be made to work. You have to start over, beginning with a working simple system. And publishing completely ignores it. Almost every single digital project or digital, even standards that publishing has tried to do over the past 20 years has been, they've taken print, which is a ready-made print, complex system that people have made over centuries and developed, and they try to replicate that incredibly complex system in digital, trying to meet all the needs that print met, and it keeps failing. It's because, it's because of Gold's law. They're trying to build something from scratch that's really complicated, and that's just very unlikely to work. So in that vein, sort of as an example of the sort of, what do I mean by when I talk about the small, hacky JavaScript tools, let's start off by doing something that BBEdit does well, and we're going to do it really badly. Because that's how things start. I mean, that's the thing about doing tool making, is that all of your whenever you begin, all of your solutions, they're all going to be incredibly embarrassing. So bear that in mind. As I'm going to sort of expose my flaws here on the screen, sort of showing you just how some of the really embarrassing solutions that I've made over the past 2 years, which then developed into something more interesting and useful. This one, I'm not going to read through, but basically what it does is that it loads every single HTML file in in the current folder, goes through each one of them, searches for a regular for its the contents of its header h1 tag. Spits it out onto the console. So it basically gives you a list of the titles of all of the HTML tags in that folder. And it's actually something that BBEdit, for example, can do quite well with its sort of search and extract function. And you build upon that later by, you can use that then to do also regular expressions to search and replace and all that, but that's all things that BBEdit does really well. So it's kind of, doesn't really seem like the smartest thing to do. But to follow, the reason why that's a decent starting point, and reason why instead of investing in just keeping on using your BBEdit snippets, and keeping on using regular expressions, once you get into the scripting environment, you can start to use more powerful tools. Like, for example, the regular expressions are a pain. They are incredibly complicated. They are arcane, and they are almost impossible to memorize. While almost any API, doesn't really matter what it is partially self-descriptive, at least more self-descriptive than a regular expression. And if you do it well, it can be really clear what you're doing. Like, for example, here, on one hand, you have a string of gobbledygook that I'm told works in some regular expression processes to find elements that with that class. Not all of them, because regular expressions they vary, and they from platform to platform. But the alternative is if you parse that same HTML file using JavaScript and the DOM, which I know isolated, but it is what we have. I think that query selector old random class thing, which actually has a typo there because it's missing the dot. That wouldn't actually work because the selectors are supposed to be CSS. So apologies for that. So if you copy and paste that into a console and it doesn't work, then you know why. But this basically lets us transition the sort of earlier kind of script into something more like this, where this is actually from a very early hack I did, where basically we have this loads a single HTML file. And unwraps all H4, all of the H4 elements, and adds a class to the H1. The reason why it unwraps all of the H4 elements is because we had an InDesign genius send us the book where every single paragraph was wrapped in an H4. the conversation before that had gone along these lines, where we'd explained to him how HTML works. You know, you have the header, that's the H1, that's the top level. You have the H2, which are the subheadings, and the H3, that the subheadings. And he said, stopped us there and then said, I got this, I understand. And then the end result was that we got everything that was below the subheading wrapped in an H4, because, you know, like 1, 2, 3, 4, logical. So instead of bothering him, I hammered together this quick script and then unwrapped all of the H4s. And just for fun, I added the class with H1 just to demonstrate that how easy it is once you get into the DOM and once you use jQuery to manipulate things and change. Doing this with a regular expression in BBEdit or some other tool would have been an incredible pain. I'm not even sure how to start. But once you get this into an environment where you have an API for the actual structure of the document, you can start doing manipulations of the structure that are, you know, kind of cool. So, you know, it's kind of awesome. But once you get into the whole reusable bit, because all of these scripts are basically where you have to sort of type out the nodes and the script, and sort of, if you want to make things more nicer and configurable, you can actually just do, Node does that for you. This is just one example. What this does is that it's a module for Node that parses the command line arguments that you give to a particular script. And it will give it to you as an object in the JavaScript environment for your script. So you can actually just tell from query the object that the module gives you, saying, you know, has the command line tool, you know, which folder does it want it to come from, things to come from, which folder does it want to go to. You know, what the file name is supposed to be. Does it really want to, does the user really want to hear everything that's going on, or just, you know, let's do it? So it's sort of, this adds another layer on these simple hacky scripts that we started off with, and now we've actually got a tool. We've got configurability, we've got repeatability, we've got you know, the ability to sort of apply it to varying contexts just by giving it different configuration options. So, I don't know about you. And so it's sort of, the recipe for success in these is, I don't want to underestimate the power of embarrassing scripts. You know, it's sort of, there's the ability to create really embarrassing solutions, but that you can gradually add to and iterate on, and develop into something more interesting, is key to almost any sort of successful project at anything except the largest companies. This is how things get made. It's especially in software. I've never been I'd never known of a large-scale software project that succeeded from scratch when you started it. And had, for example, I'd done what most people at the start of the when I started working at Unbound, had I gone with these sort of ideas and suggestions of a lot of people in publishing, we would have gone and built our own CMS. We would have built up an entire thing, and we would have failed because we didn't actually know at that time what we wanted. We didn't actually know what the problems were that we were encountering, because you can only discover those problems by making things, and you can't make the thing to make the thing that makes the thing first. You have to make something and discover what that process needs while you're making it. It's not something you can invent completely from whole cloth before you build it. And yeah, the first recipe is hacky node scripts. Whenever you have something that's repetitive, whenever you have something that, you know, you discover that you're doing this for every single project, and you're doing it exactly the same way. write it out in a script, even if it's embarrassing, even if it breaks every single software development procedure or ideal that you've ever heard of. Something that's repeatable but embarrassing is still going to be light years better than doing it by hand time and time again, even just doing it as a bash script, which I've done because that's fun, but that's me. The second part of the recipe is the fact that there are quite a few modules for Node.js to turn script into something configurable and repeatable, and combining that with what I showed you here, which is one of the key element here, which I forgot to highlight earlier, is a module called the second line from the top, called JS-DOM. It gives you basically the document object model from the browser, just purely as a command line environment. But it's completely compatible for most of the basic document manipulation that you can do in the browser. So if you so that means that you can reuse jQuery, you can reuse all of the documentation, all of the courses and skills that you develop that are out there for web development, because let's face it, there's so much more documentation on web development than there is about ebooks or ebook production. JS-DOM in a script means that you can actually reuse quite a few of those ideas, snippets, and scripts, but reuse them as command line tools for modifying and creating static HTML files that then get published as ebooks. So JS-DOM, which constantly gets improved. There's a second thing that is actually quite important for ebook production, which I haven't mentioned, but will be in the notes that I'm going to make available to you somehow. Is a module called XML Serializer. Because apparently the whole XHTML thing is a thing in ebooks and not anywhere else, really. So, but XML Serializer will take a JS-DOM document object and turn it into an XHTML, serialize it to an XHTML string, which kind of is the glue that then you can use to bind it into ebooks. The command line tool a module I use there, called Commander, is not the only one available. There are like dozens, because if you read the article I wrote for BookCraft or BookNet or ebookcraft, so the website, before this talk, there I talk about some of the tools that have come out of web development that have been built that are incredibly useful for ebook production, like CSS lint, JS hint, which is a JavaScript linter, and CSS processing modules like Post CSS. All of those things are made in Node.js, and they're using one or the other of these sort of command line modules, and almost all of them started as small, embarrassing versions of what they're now. Quite a few of them started as in-house scripts for some web development company or the other, where they iterated on it, and even though the first release that we saw publicly was something like an elegant tool, like for example CSS lint, when that first got released, was like, ooh, that looks nice. But those grew out of the small things that we can do, any single one of us, because the skill, it doesn't take a decade's worth of programming skills to create this sort of script, or even this sort of script. This is something you can you can start building up and scratching out useful things, even just because even the simplest building blocks and simplest structures can be useful, because the thing that we're all trying to banish is repetitiveness. Things that we keep doing, the tasks that we keep having to solve, but we've so long ago made them automatic in our heads, and they're cognitively they aren't something that we should be spending our energies on. You can solve quite a few of those with this sort of thing. So, tools. I'm going to sort of have sort of show you a script. It's not a script. It's a function. The last thing I'm going to show you, and I'm going to see if this is function. So, can you guess what it was for? So if I put that back up. So is there anybody who sort of looking at the script can guess what it was supposed to do? If you read quite a few of the if you read all of the IDPF specs, there's a good chance you can figure it out, and also some of the variable names give it away. Sort of anybody can guess. Yes, it's at one point, we were at Unbound sort of considering the idea of basically building out a library of licensed fonts for our books, and rather than relying on tools like InDesign or something really awkward and hacky like the one or two text sort of the one or two EPUB editing tools that supports font mangling. We hammered together this script, because font mangling is actually quite simple, to try and test out whether it was worth it. And as it turns out, given the lack of support really for how often it is that the body font tends to get overridden by sort of ebook reading apps, it wasn't really worth it. But this is a thing that then I can always reuse, and is it means I don't have to really worry about whether I can use an embedded font technically. I can always just plonk that in a script somewhere and make it work. It's really ugly, and it's quite embarrassing. If I were writing this now, I'd do it completely differently, more elegantly. But it worked, and it sort of made things that made sort of valid, as in you can't font mangling sort of by definition makes the font invalid, but it was invalid in a valid way, if that makes sense. Up top, and their entire documentation is really excellent. And it's what sort of if you're when you're starting off, no matter really where you're practicing your JavaScript, doesn't matter, even if it isn't in Mozilla, their documentation is one of those things you should be having open in one of your browser windows at all times, because it's more detailed than anything else, and some of their like introduction documents and sort of like basic how-tos are really useful. So I'd recommend the top one first. The two books there, Eloquent JavaScript and JavaScript The Good Parts, they're really good, but they've got a steep learning curve, slightly. But if you decide to do JavaScript, you really can't leave out JavaScript The Good Parts by Douglas Crockford, because JavaScript's reputation is slightly justified. It is quite hacky, it's a bit messy, and it's got really, really ugly parts. And so, the Crockford's book basically shows you which parts you should use and which parts you should ignore. And it does so in a way that, is actually quite readable. It has a bit of sense of humor, strange enough. It's sort of, but it's, anybody who even sort of walks past JavaScript should read it. And I think Eloquent JavaScript is one of the more detailed introduction texts on JavaScript. It's also, Eloquent JavaScript is available for free online. So you can just start browsing through it without paying anybody. But, I know that since you're a part of the publishing industry, you'll be keen to pay people for books. But if you, want to be a heretic and don't really want to do the whole book thing in terms of learning, these are two free solutions that people... one of the problems I have in recommending and sort of helping people learn JavaScript is that I kind of learned JavaScript as it grew up. I first started making websites when I was a teenager, and when I first learned JavaScript when it was really ugly, and it really didn't look anything like it did today. And I've been sort of keeping up with it as it grew up. So I don't really have any sort of mental model for how anybody would learn it from scratch. So I'm going by the recommendations of other people who tell me that this is how they learned it from scratch. People speak very highly about the Codecademy course, but Khan Academy, they employ the founder of jQuery through the site, and he's been a part of reorganizing their computer programming course. So that one is good as well. So I think I've covered those both. Now, any questions, sort of? Or sort of anybody delaying time, sort of buying me time while I try and remember whether I forgot something or not. No sort of questions or worries about. Can I ask you guys a question instead? Sort of, how likely is it that that your workplace, let's rephrase that as a yes/no question. Do you think that your workplace would be open to start using scripts and sort of command line tools to solve problems where you are, or sort of, as opposed to just sticking with the pre-bought InDesign or big tool? So those whose workplace would be open to using this sort of thing, raise your hands, please. That's not bad. I expected it to be a low proportion of that, but that's not bad. You people are sort of. I'm in full faith that you people will have loads of fun breaking things with JavaScript. I know I have, because you have to break things first before you fix them. And so, if there are no questions, then I think I might be done. Nobody's bringing up to the microphone. So, well, thank you very much. And I hope you forgive my overuse of the Muppets, but I'm a huge Kermit fan. So, thank you.